I'm going to show you how to create a sniper scope in Unreal. You can choose many different styles for your scope. I will be taking inspiration from the Hitman Sniper Challenge game. Begin by setting up your character and the weapon. This step is not required for the scope itself, so you can go about it however you'd like. Also, I will be using the third-person template, but you can use the first-person template as well. We will transition from the player camera to the sniper scope. Begin by duplicating your current camera boom and give it a name that indicates you're aiming. Make sure that you don't have any socket offset, and the target arm length shouldn't be set to be much either, because if you do, you will get a weird effect like this. So if you want to adjust the camera location, use the target offset instead. You can use input actions if you'd like, but for the sake of the tutorial, I will use keyboard inputs directly. This will be our aim input. If you have an animation to use for the character to begin aiming, then add it here. Add a flip-flop. Create a new bool variable and give it a name that indicates you're aiming. Set it to be true on A and false on B. Drag out a reference to our camera and the new camera boom we just created. Get a attach component to component node and connect the camera boom to be the parent. Then drag out a move component to node and connect the camera to be the component. Set the time you want it to take for your camera to fade into position. You can also choose to ease in and out. It's not fading in the way we want to. In order to fix this, we need to change these settings from keep relative to keep world. There we go. If your mesh or weapon overlaps and are visible, you can set these to be hidden when aiming. Duplicate the code above, but change the camera boom to be your character's default one. Now we can aim. So let's move on to adding the scope. Find or create a sniper scope that you want to use. You can choose to have a black background or nothing. I found this scope. Drag your desired image into Paint and make sure that there's no background inside the scope, and around, if you're going for this kind of scope. You can also edit the scope with text or screws like I did here, taking inspiration from Hitman. Once you're done, save it as a PNG and drag it into your game. Create a new widget and give it a relevant name. Add a canvas panel and image. Set it to be the image we added and scale it properly. Make sure to anchor the image to the middle and center the reticle. Make sure that the image fills the top and bottom. Add the widget to the viewport and make sure to promote it to a variable since we're going to use it later. Remove the widget when not aiming. We use an isValid node to prevent errors because we don't want the game to remove something that may not exist. Now we have our scope. If you want to change the scale, like me, make sure that the reticle is still in the center. In order to prevent button spam abuse, let's add a do once node. Add a small delay before resetting it. Now that we can aim, let's add our scope zoom in function. There are two ways you can do this. One is to zoom in 2 to 3 times, adding a lot of zoom each time, or you can use your mouse to gradually zoom in. I will go with the first option, since this is what Hitman is doing. But if you would like the second option, I'll show you this later. Add mouse wheel up input and check if we're aiming. In order to check whether we have zoomed in more than 3 times, we will need to add another branch and to create an integer variable. We have the do once node to make sure we don't zoom in more than once at a time. Increment the variable we just created and make sure its default value is set to 1. Add a switch on int node and change the field of view to be less on option 2 and even less on option 3. You can add as many options here as you'd like, but most games use 2 or 3. We don't need to set the first because it will start at 1 by default. Add the same code for the mouse scroll down, but here we need to check if the aim number equals 1. And we decrement the number instead. Make sure to set the 1 here and set the value to be your camera's default value. In my case, 90. Make sure to connect the ends to reset the do once node. Now we can zoom in and out, but our aim sensitivity is way too much while zooming in. Create a new float variable. Set its default value to be 1. Go to your character's camera input. If you have a third-person template, it should look exactly like this. Add a multiply subnode and multiply the value with the variable we just created. Set the sensitivity variable to be less than 1 when zooming in and reduce it as the number increases. These values will depend entirely on your game, so make sure to experiment with different options. Now we have reduced our aim sensitivity when zooming in. The next step is optional, if you want to add like a breathing effect. Using your sniper image as reference, add a set render translation node. Split the values. You can choose to add some right or left movement as well, but I will only make up and down movement. Create a new variable for the y-axis and connect the code to the construct node. Add the variable value with an add subnode and set it to be the new variable value. Delay by a very small amount and connect to a branch. Check if the value is greater or equal to something like 15. Again, these values will depend on your game and your scope. Connect the false to another branch and check if the value is less than or equal to -6. Connect the false to the first node. Then connect the upper branch true to a delay node. Promote the below variable and give it a name. Set its default value to be something like 0.2. After the delay, set the value to be -0.2 and reconnect it to the first node. Do the same thing below, but set the value to be 0.2. So essentially what this code does is that it increases the widget image position gradually, and then it checks whether the image has reached its limit. If it has, we switch to increasing the widget image position, and the code repeats itself, thus giving us a breathing-like effect. If the image clips, like mine here, we will need to adjust the branch check values or increase the scale of your image. You can also set the delay node value to be random, so the character seems like he's breathing at different intervals. We're almost done. Now we need to add the shooting effects. So in order to make it look realistic, we need the sniper to go up when shooting to simulate recoil. And we also need to spawn a bullet in the right place. Add your shooting input button and check if we're aiming. Again, add a do once node to prevent abuse. Before moving on, let's create a bullet. It doesn't need to be anything special, just make sure to add a projectile movement and something that can overlap other actors. Alternatively, design your bullet to look good. But in some games, the bullet isn't even visible, so it's up to you. Set your sniper bullet speed. If you want the bullet to reach the target with a small delay to make it look more realistic, experiment with different speed values to see what works best. Also, make sure to remove the gravity from the bullet. Add a spawn actor from class node and split the transform value. Set the class to be your bullet. So in order for the bullet to come from the right place, we need it to shoot from the camera directly. This will align with our scope reticle if it's set to be in the middle. Drag out the camera variable and get a get world location subnode. Connect it to the location. Now we need to set the rotation. Get a get base aim rotation subnode and connect it to the rotation. This essentially gets the rotation of where we're currently looking. Very useful for a situation like this. Perfect. You can add code for the bullet overlapping your actors and so on, but I have already done this. In order to simulate the upwards movement of the scope, we need to use a timeline. Make sure to play it from start. From the camera, get relative rotation. The y-axis is responsible for upwards movement. We're going to move the camera up by using the Set Relative Rotation node. Split the rotation and connect it to the update. Add a lerp subnode and connect it to the y. Connect the x and z to its default value. Connect the a to the y value and the b to add a value around 0.3. Again, these values will depend on your game. In the timeline, add a float value and set the time to be how fast you want the scope to go up. Hold in Shift and press on the line. Set the time and value to be 0. Repeat, but set the value to be 1 and the time to be the time you set. Connected to the alpha. Now we need to do the same thing for the scope moving down. Create the same code, but instead of increasing the value, decrease it. Now the scope is moving up and down, but in Hitman, the scope will move down a little slower, and the scope also moves a little bit to the right. So this is optional, but to make it look realistic, let's tweak some values. Also, let's lerp the Z value as well, which will make the camera go right. Make the exact same code, but for the Z value. Now the camera will go right as well. This works fine, but to make it a little smoother, we need to increase the time it takes for the scope to come down. So, as a safety precaution, when the update is finished, set the camera value to be 0. This is so if you add by 3 for example and decrease by 3, the value might come down to be -2 when it's done. To prevent imbalances with the camera, set it to be 0 when finished. Instead of having the same value as the first timeline, I will increase the time here. To find the perfect values, you will need to test it out for yourself, or you can use what I use here. Then we also need to decrease the value here and on the y-axis. We now have the camera moving, but we also need the widget to move to further add the realistic shooting. Create a custom event and give it a name. Using the sniper image as reference, add a set render scale node and split the values. Promote this to a variable. Set the scale to be scale plus something like 0.05. Then add a branch and check if the image scale is greater than or equals 1.25. On the false, add a delay node and connect it to the scale node. On true, add another delay and do the same thing we did now, but decrease the value. Check if the value is less or equal to 1. On false, connect it to the scale node. Also, set the scale to be 1 in the beginning as a precaution. Call the event we just created in the shoot part of our code, using the widget reference. That looks so much smoother. So the sniper is now complete, we just have to fix a couple of bugs. So first, the scope should disappear a little earlier. Second, when we zoom in once and zoom out completely, the field of view is messed up. We also need to smoothen the process. Third, we need to reset our aim number when leaving the aim. And fourth, we need to reset our camera sensitivity when leaving the aim. Create a new event and connect it the way I do. This event will check whether our field of view is the way it should be when leaving the zoom, and if it isn't, it will gradually set it to be. Also, set these values on the leave aim code. Set the sensitivity to be the same value as zoom 2 when aiming. You can also add shooting sounds or other scopes. Thanks for watching. Unfortunately, I didn't get to add the blur in the corners here, kind of like in the Hitman game. This is because it's actually a little more difficult than it seems, and it would just take way too much time. And this video is long enough as it is.